The phrase, hell is other people, comes from Jean-Paul Sartre's 1944 play, No Exit, We Clos, and though it has often been misunderstood as a blanket misanthropic claim, its meaning is both more subtle and more disturbing. This is not about the annoyance of noisy neighbors or the betrayals of toxic relationships. It's about the prison we build from the inside, using the gaze of others as the bars. Imagine a room with no mirrors, no windows, no sleep. Just three people, strangers at first, confined together for eternity. This is Sartre's setting, a parlor in hell. At first glance, it seems mild, even absurdly benign. No flames, no demons, just company. But as the characters converse, masks start to fall. Secrets are unearthed, guilt clings to the walls, and slowly, the true punishment reveals itself. Not torture, but exposure. Not solitude, but the impossibility of ever being alone with oneself. The paradox begins here. We crave the validation of others to define ourselves, yet we are trapped by their judgments. We wish to be free, yet are tethered to the expectations, interpretations, and opinions of those around us. Sartre's characters learn that their identities are no longer their own. Each becomes a distorted reflection in the eyes of the others, condemned to be seen forever through someone else's lens. Sartre, a central figure in existentialist philosophy, believed that consciousness is not a fixed essence, but a constant becoming. Our self is not something we possess. It is something we perform endlessly for others. The look of the other, le regard, transforms us. It can reduce us to an object, stripping away our interiority. To be seen is to be fixed, pinned like a butterfly under glass. This is what Sartre meant. Hell is being forever seen, judged, misunderstood, and unable to escape. Consider modern life. Social media has made this paradox tangible. We craft profiles, curate images, write captions not just to express, but to be perceived a certain way. We seek likes, retweets, approval, tiny affirmations of existence. But the more we're seen, the less control we have over how we are seen. Each post becomes another brick in the persona we cannot escape. The algorithm is the new gaze. The audience is the new inferno. This tension appears in psychology too. Carl Rogers spoke of the conditions of worth imposed by society, shaping who we believe we must be in order to be loved. Irving Goffman described life as a performance, where we present different faces depending on the stage we occupy. We wear roles like second skins. We lose track of where the mask ends and the face begins. Even in intimate settings, the paradox persists. We long to be truly known, but to be known is to be exposed. Vulnerability is not safe. It invites reinterpretation. The person we love can never see us exactly as we see ourselves. Their perception, no matter how well-intentioned, becomes a separate reality. And sometimes, the gap between their version of us and our own becomes unbearable. Wittgenstein, in his philosophical investigations, explored how language fails to fully convey the inner world. If even our words cannot bridge the subjective divide, then how can we hope to be fully seen or to truly see another? Every look is a translation, and every translation is an approximation. We are condemned to be incomplete in each other's eyes. So, is isolation the answer? Sartre would say no. We are beings for others. We are thrown into a world with others, and there's no exit from that condition. The challenge, then, is not to escape the gaze, but to learn how to live under it. To accept that we are seen imperfectly, and that we too see imperfectly. To stop seeking a final, fixed identity, and instead live with ambiguity, contradiction, and change. In the end, perhaps hell is other people not because they torment us, but because they mirror us. And mirrors do not lie, but they never show the whole story. There is a silence that disturbs more than screams, the silence of meaning stripped bare, of morality reduced to appetite, of humanity dissolved into raw impulse. This is the terrain of Sadean nihilism, a philosophy not just of darkness, but of indifference. It is not the cry of rebellion against God, but the shrug that comes after God has been declared irrelevant. In the bleak landscape carved by the Marquis de Sade, there is no justice, no virtue, no cosmic order, only power, desire, and the inevitability of their collision. To enter Sade's world is to leave behind the comforts of ethical coherence. His characters do not sin because they are tempted. They sin because they are free. They do not justify their actions through reason or emotion. They revel in them and then question the very need for justification. Here, cruelty is not an aberration. It is a logical consequence of a universe without transcendent values. If there is no God, no soul, no final judgment, then why not indulge every desire, no matter how violent, obscene, or transgressive? Sadean nihilism is not mere hedonism. It is more ruthless. Hedonism still assumes a kind of value, that pleasure is good, but Sade goes further. In his universe, even pleasure is suspect. What matters is domination, the act of exercising will, regardless of the cost. Pain and pleasure collapse into one another. The screams of the victim become the lullaby of the predator. The categories blur, until all that remains is force. Friedrich Nietzsche read Sade as a kind of grotesque truth-teller, someone who tore off the moral disguises of Christian civilization and exposed its rotting core. But even Nietzsche, who danced on the graves of dead gods, seemed uneasy with Sade's abyss. Sade doesn't offer a new set of values. He annihilates the very need for them. In Justine, virtue is punished again and again, not by accident, but by design. The universe mocks those who believe in fairness. The innocent suffer precisely because they are innocent, and the strong, the cruel, the shameless, they flourish. This inversion of morality is central to Sadean nihilism. It forces a terrifying question. What if evil triumphs not despite the order of things, but because there is no order at all? The philosopher Georges Bataille, who was both fascinated and repulsed by Sade, saw him not as a pornographer, but as a metaphysician of excess. Sade did not merely describe sexual perversions, he elevated them to a kind of negative theology. If God is dead, Sade seems to say, then blasphemy becomes the only sacred act. The body, mutilated and consumed, becomes a sacrament of meaninglessness. What remains is a theater of cruelty in which the sacred and the profane are indistinguishable. In the psychological realm, Sade's vision unsettles our assumptions about human nature. Are we truly altruistic or merely constrained by fear and social norms? Sigmund Freud suggested that beneath the thin veneer of civilization lies a seething mass of aggression and libido. For Sade, that veneer is laughably transparent. The superego, morality, empathy, these are not pillars of our being, but fragile constructions we cling to out of fear. And yet, there is a strange clarity in Sadean nihilism. It does not deceive. It does not promise redemption. It does not pretend that history bends toward justice. It holds up a mirror, cracked and cruel, and asks, what if this is all there is? In a world increasingly defined by moral relativism, by algorithmic control, by the commodification of every desire, Sade's provocations remain disturbingly relevant. His nihilism forces a confrontation. If nothing has inherent meaning, then what will we choose to mean? If morality is a game, then who writes the rules? And if suffering can be aestheticized, rationalized, even eroticized, then where do we draw the line? Perhaps that is the ultimate horror of Sadean nihilism. Not that it is true, but that we cannot dismiss it entirely. It lingers, like a whisper at the edge of reason, a challenge not to our virtue, but to our certainty that virtue matters at all. And so we are left with the echo of a question, one that no ideology, no religion, no progress narrative can fully silence. What remains when all that restrained us is gone? There are kinds of suffering that make sense. The aching legs of the climber, the heartbreak of lost love, the grief at a funeral. We wrap these in meaning, sacrifice, beauty, memory. They hurt, but they fit into a story. But there is another kind of suffering, one that resists narrative, that sprawls, irrational, across innocent lives. A child born into pain, a mind unraveling without cause, a scream in a war no one remembers starting. This is dysteleological suffering, agony without purpose, without end, without reason. In a world shaped by teleology, the belief that things happen for a purpose, we search instinctively for why. Ancient myths gave us gods to explain the flood, the famine, the plague. Religions offered divine plans too grand for our comprehension. Even in science, we often unconsciously seek purpose in evolution, progress, history. But dysteleological suffering rejects this impulse. It confronts us with a possibility many cannot bear, that some suffering is not for anything. It simply is. Philosophically, the problem is ancient. In the book of Job, a righteous man is struck by calamity. His friends, Believers in divine justice insist he must have sinned, but Job knows he did not. He demands answers. God replies not with reasons, but with scale. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Job is silenced, not comforted. The suffering remains unexplained. Centuries later, the existentialists took up the question again, in a world where God had become silent. For Albert Camus, the universe was indifferent. In the myth of Sisyphus, he writes of a man condemned to push a boulder endlessly uphill, only to watch it roll back down. The absurd is not suffering alone. It is the collision between suffering and the longing for meaning. Camus proposes defiance, to imagine Sisyphus happy, but this is a fragile answer, a rebellion, not a resolution. Modern science, too, reveals a universe that cares little for our pain. Evolution is blind. Natural disasters are indifferent. Disease is mechanical. In the face of this, we often turn to narratives of personal growth. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But these are coping strategies, not explanations. Some things do kill. Some wounds do not lead to wisdom. Some lives end without catharsis. Psychology recognizes this tension. Viktor Frankl, survivor of the Holocaust, believed in the human capacity to find meaning even in horror. But trauma research shows us that meaning-making is not always possible. Some people never heal. Some memories are too shattered to integrate. Post-traumatic growth exists, but so does post-traumatic silence, where the only truth is the weight of what happened. And what of the child in a hospital bed, dying before memory even begins? What of entire species wiped out in silence by human expansion? What of the solitary aging mind slipping into dementia with no one to witness? These are not moral tests. They are not punishments. They are not steps in a higher journey. They are simply brutal facts. Dysteleological suffering strips us of illusions. It asks not what we can learn from pain, but whether we can endure it without pretending it means something. It is the logical endpoint of a world without guarantees. The philosopher Thomas Metzinger speaks of phenomenal suffering as an evolutionary side effect, real, vivid, and utterly unnecessary. Pain, once useful for survival, now persists even when it serves no function. Our neurology betrays us. And yet, here we are, beings who suffer and still ask why. There is a strange dignity in this questioning. In resisting the impulse to invent meaning, we approach a different kind of truth, not a comforting one, but a clear one. We become witnesses to reality unfiltered by myth. We stop asking the universe to make sense, and instead ask how we can live honestly within its silence. Some respond with creation. Art becomes a protest against meaningless pain. Others respond with compassion. If suffering is not deserved, then empathy is not optional. We care not because pain teaches us something, but because it doesn't, because it is undeserved, and therefore unbearable if faced alone. Dysteleological suffering is not a call to despair. It is a call to responsibility, to be the meaning that does not exist, to hold each other when no cosmic order will, to speak the names of the forgotten, to light candles in a void not because it changes the darkness, but because it affirms that we saw it and refused to look away. And perhaps that is enough, not to explain the suffering, not to justify it, but to face it, together. There is a moment, subtle and sudden, when the self recoils from something it cannot fully reject nor fully accept. A dead body, the blood on a bathroom floor, a scream too close to a laugh. This is the moment of objection. It is not fear, though fear may follow. It is not disgust, though disgust often rises with it. Abjection is the collapse of boundaries, between self and other, life and death, clean and unclean. It is the feeling that the world, or perhaps the self, has become alien, too close and too unknown at once. The philosopher and psychoanalyst Julia Kristeva brought this concept into sharp focus in her work Powers of Horror. She described abjection as what the ego casts off in order to constitute itself. We build our sense of self by drawing lines, me versus not me, human versus animal, sacred versus profane. But what happens when these lines blur? What happens when what we thought we expelled, waste, filth, trauma, the corpse, returns, not outside us, but as part of us? The corpse is Kristeva's quintessential example. It is not merely dead matter. It is a reminder that this is what we are, or will be. It is the self-turned object. We are revolted not just because it smells or decays, but because it reflects our own hidden fragility. The abject reminds us that we are not sealed units, not cleanly bounded identities. We leak, we break, we rot. Abjection appears in the earliest moments of life. The infant at the mother's breast must at some point differentiate, realize that the mother is not part of the self. That separation is violent, primal, foundational. Kristeva suggests that abjection is part of how subjectivity is formed, by ejecting what is necessary but intolerable. This includes bodily fluids, excrement, vomit, but also traumas, taboos, social exiles. Religion encodes abjection in rituals of purity and sin. The leper, the menstruating woman, the blasphemer, each marked not simply as dangerous, but as contaminating. Mary Douglas, the anthropologist, wrote that dirt is matter out of place. The abject is precisely that. What does not belong, what breaks the map. It is not just filth, it is disorder. And in a world obsessed with order, that is terrifying. In horror cinema, abjection is everywhere. The shapeshifter, the possessed child, the bleeding wound that will not close. All are images of boundary collapse. The monster is not always the other. It is often the self-deformed, mirrored, grotesquely familiar. In David Cronenberg's films, flesh itself rebels. In The Fly, a man's transformation into insect is not just terrifying because of pain, but because of dissolution, of identity, of humanness, of control. Abjection also haunts the social world. The addict on the sidewalk, the mentally ill shouting at invisible demons, the undocumented body pulled from the sea. These are not just tragic figures. They are reminders of what the social order must suppress to maintain its illusion of coherence. The abject is what must not be seen, even though it is made by the very systems that reject it. And yet, abjection is not only about revulsion. There is a strange intimacy in it, a closeness that unnerves. The abject is not far, it is too close. It is the return of the repressed, the shadow in the mirror, the whisper that we are not whole. Kristeva links abjection to art, especially modern art, where beauty is no longer pure and the grotesque becomes sublime. In Francis Bacon's paintings, for example, the body is twisted, raw, screaming, not just suffering, but exposing the mechanisms of suffering. We may try to repress the abject, to sanitize, to separate, but it returns, in disease, in nightmares, in grief, in desire. And in that return, it asks a question we cannot easily answer. Who am I, if I am not what I cast away? To live with abjection is to live with the knowledge that identity is fragile, that civilization is a skin stretched tight over chaos, that the self is always on the edge of disintegration. But perhaps there is honesty in this. In facing the abject, we see the limits of control, the illusion of purity. We see ourselves, not as we wish to be, but as we are, permeable, vulnerable, unfinished. And maybe in that recognition, there is a strange kind of grace, not the grace of transcendence, but of acceptance, of knowing that what repels us is also what connects us, that the boundary is not a wall, but a trembling threshold, and that on the other side, always, waits the part of us we cannot throw away. The words are simple, 3 of them, but together they shake the ground beneath centuries of belief. God is dead. When Friedrich Nietzsche wrote this in The Gay Science and later echoed it in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he wasn't celebrating. He wasn't mocking religion, as many assume. He was mourning, warning even. The proclamation was not an act of triumph, but an existential diagnosis, a recognition that the foundations of Western meaning were crumbling, and that no one yet understood what that would cost. To say God is dead is not to say that a deity has literally died. Nietzsche, a philosopher and philologist, used the phrase metaphorically. What he meant was this: the idea of God, as the ultimate source of truth, morality, and order, no longer held sway in the minds of the educated. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason, science, and individual autonomy, had slowly eroded the metaphysical scaffolding that held the Christian worldview together. People still went to church, but their faith was hollow. God had died in their hearts before they noticed he was missing. In The Gay Science, Nietzsche tells the parable of the madman. A figure runs into the marketplace, lantern in hand, crying out that he seeks God. The people laugh, they no longer believe, but the madman grows serious. God is dead, he says, and we have killed him. The crowd falls silent. The weight of the words lingers. We have killed him. This is the paradox. Nietzsche isn't blaming atheists or scientists or modern philosophers. He's pointing to all of us. Humanity, through its pursuit of truth, had undermined the grand narrative that once gave life coherence. But in tearing it down, we created a vacuum. The death of God was not just a metaphysical event. It was a cultural catastrophe. Because if God is dead, what takes his place? Nietzsche foresaw the consequences. Without a transcendent anchor, morality would become unmoored. Values would become relative. Meaning would become manufactured. In this void, nihilism would rise, not as an idea, but as a condition. The slow, creeping sense that nothing matters, that everything is arbitrary, that life has no intrinsic purpose. This wasn't an abstract fear. Nietzsche had seen the early signs in the 19th century, the moral fatigue, the religious hypocrisy, the mechanization of belief. He predicted that the 20th century would be an age of turmoil as humanity struggled to reinvent meaning. And he was right. The century that followed saw 2 world wars, genocides, totalitarian ideologies, and the rise and fall of political religions. Each in its way tried to fill the void God left behind, with race, with nation, with progress, with power. But Nietzsche didn't want us to retreat into despair. He believed that the death of God, while terrifying, was also a profound opportunity. If we could no longer rely on inherited values, we would have to become creators of value. We would have to confront the terrifying freedom of shaping our own lives, unaided by divine authority. He called this the birth of the Übermensch, the overman, the one who lives beyond good and evil, who affirms life in the face of its absurdity. Few have dared to follow that path. Most have turned back, or worse, clung to new idols, markets, screens, ideologies that promise order but deliver emptiness. The modern world is full of signs that God is dead and that nothing has taken his place. Loneliness is epidemic. Anxiety saturates even the privileged. We are drowning in information but starving for wisdom. Yet in this void, some have found a strange kind of clarity. Writers like Albert Camus and Simone de Beauvoir embraced the absurd as a fact, not a flaw. Meaning, they said, is not given, it is made. Not found in heaven, but created on earth, in our actions, our relationships, our courage. Camus imagined Sisyphus endlessly pushing his rock, not as a tragic figure, but as a hero, smiling in defiance. So where does that leave us? We live after the death of God. The sky no longer speaks. The commandments no longer command, and yet the world remains, vast, beautiful, indifferent. We remain, fragile, searching, capable of cruelty, and yet of kindness too. The question is no longer whether God exists. It is whether we can live truthfully in his absence. Can we bear the weight of freedom? Can we build meaning without illusion? Can we love, create, forgive, not because we are commanded to, but because we choose to? That is the inheritance of Nietzsche's most famous phrase. Not just a diagnosis, but a demand. God is dead. Now what will you do with the silence? There is a peculiar discomfort that arises when we pause in a mirror, not just to adjust our hair or inspect a wrinkle, but to truly see ourselves. Who is this person, we wonder, staring back with such familiarity and such strangeness? In that moment, something slips. We are no longer just ourselves. We are observers of ourselves. Split, doubled, aware. And in that fragile instant, we begin to sense what Jean-Paul Sartre called being and nothingness. 2 fundamental modes of existence, perpetually entangled. Sartre's 1943 philosophical work Being and Nothingness is a sprawling, dense, and often confounding exploration of consciousness, freedom, and the structures of human existence. But at its core lies a deceptively simple idea. To be conscious is to be lack. To be human is to be a whole in being. He draws a sharp line between 2 kinds of being. The first is what he calls being in itself, en soi, the being of objects, of things, a rock, a chair, a tree. These exist fully in themselves without question, without distance. They are what they are, solid, inert, complete. The second kind is being for itself, pour soi, the being of consciousness. Unlike the rock, we are not what we are. We are always what we are not yet. We exist as a question, a project, a tension. We are aware of ourselves, and that awareness creates a gap, a nothingness, between us and our being. We do not simply exist. We exist toward, exist away from, exist in relation to. This gap is the source of our freedom and our anguish. To be conscious, Sartre says, is to be free. Not free in the sense of doing whatever we please, but free in a more radical way. We are never fixed. We are always exceeding ourselves. There is no essence, no soul, no inner script that defines who we must be. We make ourselves through our choices, every moment. Even refusing to choose is a choice. Even claiming to be determined is a decision to deny responsibility. And herein lies the burden. There are no excuses. In one of his most famous examples, Sartre describes a waiter who is too much of a waiter. Every gesture, every movement, is exaggerated, performed. He is not being a waiter. He is playing one. This, Sartre argues, is bad faith, mauvaise foi. The lie we tell ourselves to avoid the weight of freedom. We convince ourselves we are things, identities, roles, functions, so we don't have to face the terror of being nothing more than a becoming. But the truth is harsher. We are not defined by our past, our labels, our circumstances. We are condemned to be free, and that condemnation lies in the fact that we cannot escape choice, not even in refusing to act. We are the authors of our own meaning, in a world that offers no inherent one. This is not nihilism. It is confrontation. Sartre believed that we must create value, not discover it. That dignity lies not in submission to a higher power or an absolute truth, but in the courage to live authentically in a world without guarantees. Of course, this freedom is not solitary. Others are always present. And here, Sartre's thought turns darker. When another looks at us, we become an object in their world. We feel seen, limited, judged. The famous example of the man peeking through a keyhole who suddenly realizes he is being watched. This is the moment when being for itself becomes being for others. We are no longer just ourselves. We are what we imagine the other sees in us. This, too, is a kind of nothingness, a self estranged from itself. In everyday life, this happens constantly. We smile a little more in company, perform slightly differently depending on who we're with. We are not faking. We are becoming through the eyes of others. But that also means our freedom is always under pressure. We long for recognition, but risk becoming prisoners of how we are perceived. Yet Sartre does not end in despair. His vision is severe, but not hopeless. If we are nothing, then we are not constrained. If we have no fixed essence, then we are open. We are the only species, he writes, whose existence precedes its essence. We live first and define ourselves after. Being and nothingness is not a roadmap. It is a mirror, a disorienting one. It reveals not who we are, but that who we are is always in flux, always unfinished, always ours to shape. So when you look in the mirror and feel that strange split, that fleeting sense that you are both here and not quite here, you are touching, however briefly, the essence of Sartre's insight. We are, but we are not what we are, and we are what we are not. And in that paradox, we find our freedom.